I'm Amy Gutman, and this is Perspectives in Motion, an original podcast about the people, the places, and the ideas shaping our lives in the age of urbanization, brought to you by Schindler. We're joined by Darren Comber, architect and CEO at Scott Brownrigg, an award-winning architectural practice based in London. The firm has a global footprint with offices in New York, Singapore, Amsterdam, and alliances in the Middle East. Darren studied at the Bartlett, University College London. He's a member of the Royal Institute of British Architects and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. In his current role, Comber has two key focus areas: the global expansion of Scott Brownrigg and sustainability, leading many high-profile and award-winning schemes. Darren is driving Scott Brownrigg's response to COVID-19 and helping to shape the firm's approach to the built environment of the future. Welcome, Darren.
Thank you for inviting me.
We like to begin each episode with a bit of personal background. What initially attracted you to the field of architecture and design?
Well, arts and design were always a focus for me. Since I was about 6 or 7, I was always drawing or spending my time doing that. So I think it was a given that I'd do something in that field. But it wasn't until I was about 16 that I suddenly decided that's what I wanted to do. I looked at the construction industry and thought this was an interesting industry, but really my gravitation was really based on design and drawing and draftsmanship at that time. So it was a bit of a natural segue in for me to do architecture. And from the time I started doing it, I just became sort of workaholic. It was everything that I wanted to do. It takes you into so many different things as well. You can explore, just being an architect doesn't mean, say, you just design buildings. You can look at societal changes, you can look at urban design, the environment. So it brings in so many different things. So I was really fortunate that everything I seemed to become interested in, architecture gave me that platform to work with.
As you reflect on your career path, is there anything you would change?
I don't think I'd change anything. I think what I would encourage everybody to do is take every opportunity and see what's in that and what's within that job that you might get, because changing when you finish university is very, very difficult. And I finished in the recession in the 90s, so there wasn't really a lot of opportunity. There wasn't a lot of work around, and I wouldn't say I had my dream job offered to me, but I was one of the very few fortunate people that had a job, and that was something that I was very fortunate for. I felt that I had to make the most of the opportunity and do what I could with it. And it was quite a bizarre situation, because the work that I was doing for this practice was big and corporate. It wasn't really what I wanted to do. And as I say, dream job at 23, no, it wasn't any of that. However, one day I was pinning up at the Royal Fine Arts Commission, and I was pinning something up that I hadn't designed, and I was just a young guy just pinning stuff up that I didn't really believe in. And next to me, there was a really beautiful scheme. And I thought, that's the practice. That's the sort of thing I want to be doing. And that's where I'd like to take my career if I can. And I looked at who it was, and it was Scott Brownrigg. And so purely by accident, there I was in front of a firm that one day I never thought I'd actually be running. Opportunities come out of left field for you quite often. And it's making sure that you can recognise they're there, and also use them to your own advantage so that you can make the most out of your career, so that when you look back on your career, you can really think, okay, I had talents, I had whatever it might be, and I really made the most of those talents. So I look back and think, yeah, with the talents I had, I made the best out of the career that I could.
Well, I think even beyond helping you define what it is you like and don't like, these jobs can also help us define even better what we're actually good at and maybe what we're less good at, which we don't always know at the tender age of 22 or 23.
Yeah. And I think that's right too, because when I was studying, I guess I always knew that design was the front-end design and the Imagineering and the ideas side of things was something that I was perhaps better suited to. The detail, most people who work with me now, once it gets on site, you don't want me on site because I'm sort of like looking at the next thing, and so I'm always on to the next thing before I've sometimes even finished the first thing. So that's just perhaps my character. So I guess I always knew that I wanted to do the design side of things. I think when you look back and you think, what would I change in architecture? It's perhaps because you've taken the wrong paths sometimes. And that's really, really important, that you take every opportunity you're given and you maximise the potential from that opportunity.
Even the wrong jobs, right?
Quite often the wrong jobs, because it might be wrong for you, but there might be something in there that you can really get out of it that allows you to develop in a different way that you're unaware that you have a talent for. So I quite often think there is no such thing as a wrong job. There's just a wrong attitude. There's quite often some of the buildings, in my early career, I was given to design, and people would turn their nose up now and go, oh, I don't want to do that. I found a way to sort of turn them into something that I would enjoy, and actually we could get some beauty out of, and all of those things. And I think that sort of energetic and motivational attitude to approaching architecture is self-prolific, because then it becomes something that everybody wants to be part of. And I think that for all of us is a quality to really sort of hang on to and say, look, take every opportunity, maximise the potential from it.
How do you see the role of an architect changing in society, especially now?
That's quite a broad question. I think for architecture, because it covers so many different aspects of society, if you take the current situation we're in now, we have a design research unit in Scott Brownrigg. So when, back in February, March, when this all really started for us, we looked at what can we do as architects to respond to the challenge ahead. And it's very much an issue that you can either just sit back and go, okay, well, there's nothing really I could do, or you can say, well, look, I've got these skills and talents, and so I'm going to explore them, or use them to explore what we can do. And so I think the role of the architects has changed to a degree by deploying our entire research body into looking at how we could deal with contagions in the built environment. And that's not just the physical side of things. So, how you get into buildings, how you use doors and all those things. A lot of those things are quite obvious. It's actually looking at how will the urban fabric change? How will we use our towns, our cities, our villages even? Because unlike pandemics of the past that really shaped major towns and cities in particular, because if you think about tuberculosis or major flu epidemics, or where cities were either changed through attitudes towards sanitation, better sanitation, and everything that went with that. Here, the COVID situation is very, very different, because it started, if you like, in one place, and then before you knew it was even in a ski resort, and we were asking people not to go skiing in Italy. So, this isn't localised to just cities, it's actually quite global. So you have to look at this on a much wider scale. The role is going to expand, if you like, for me, because there's a misconception sometimes an architect just designs a building, and that's actually only a very, very small part of what we do. It is much wider than that. The other thing I think we have the opportunity to do as architects is that the visionary side of things and the dynamics that brings is the ability to connect lots of different industries together. So if you consider the current situation we're in, the opportunity that I found was that I could reach out to so many different industries, and because I'm fortunate, I know quite a lot of people at the top of those industries, they're all willing to engage, and whether that be on materials technology, whether it was airflow technology, whether it's building digital twin models, which we have our own digital twin unit, which can build three-dimensional models, and then you can look at airflows within buildings, how you can deal with pathogens within spaces. So dealing with lots and lots and bringing lots of people together is actually a quality a lot of architects do have, because we're not just looking at one thing, we try and look at everything. And we know we can't do it all, but we can quite often know the people who do, that can actually then come together. So I think the role of the architect is not going to change fundamentally, but it is going to add a lot of more layers in that perhaps weren't immediately apparent to everybody before the situation that we find ourselves in.
Well, I think increasingly, as we've seen the rise in smart cities, and whether you're fatigued by that moniker or not, one of the roles that smart buildings has played has been one of public health. I don't think historically, if we look back 20 years plus, we've really ever placed such demands on our buildings to play a big role in public health to the same degree that we have been increasingly over the last decade or two, and certainly now.
If we consider where we are sustainability-wise here today, it's the aspect of thinking, well, 20 years ago, the sustainability wasn't on everyone's agenda, so people didn't really pay too much cognizance to it. So although as architects we were trying to do it and promote it, quite often people said, well, if I can't charge more money for this building, then why am I going to do it? And whilst I understand that to one degree, it's very difficult then to push forward an agenda, because every aspect of society is driven by finance. And so if you can't finance it, you can't build it. And all of the best architects in the world will tell you that. It's great having a building, but if no one wants to finance it and build it, you'll all be doing paper designs for the rest of your life. So you have to have that sense of reality that comes into this. But when we promoted sustainability so much back in the early 2000s, if you like, it's nearly 20 years ago, there was this sense of wanting to do it, but nobody really wanted to embrace it. Then all of a sudden, sustainability was seen to be very, very beneficial to society. So the banks wouldn't then lend the money to the developers, and the developers then couldn't build the buildings unless they could demonstrate it had sustainability credentials. Now, if you turn that to where we are now and think about the pandemic that we're in, I think we're going to have a very similar situation, that all of a sudden people realise that buildings that promote health and well-being are what you're going to want to be in. And it's not that we haven't been doing them, it's just the emphasis is placed hugely greater in terms of where we're going to go. So airflows within buildings, having buildings that can actually have access to fresh air, to external spaces, being able to have spaces within buildings that promote well-being within them, are going to be at a premium. People that come back to buildings have been used to having a certain way of life that promotes health and well-being. Now, that's on one level, because we shouldn't then underestimate the value of people being together. And so when we think about, well, is this the death of the office space or the workplace? 100% that is not the case, and that is not my belief. People need to be with other people. And there's a health and well-being and a mental health well-being that we've heard so much about, and that's absolutely fundamental. It is not natural for us to be all segregated from other people. But I think what we will see then is, out of this, there will be a lot more sophisticated end users. So people will demand more from their buildings, and workforce will say, well, I'm not just going to go back there and sit in an air-conditioned building where if one person gets sick in the corner, we all get it, because people are not going to want that. We've seen the effects of what that can do. So there has to be quantum change, and we have a responsibility to make that change happen.
I want to talk about where we're sitting here, because this location could not be more relevant to the discussion we're having about the role of sustainability in architecture, and also the fact that you and Scott Brownrigg have really been some of the early pioneers in sustainability in architecture. 16 years ago, you led the design of this building, Red Kite House, here at Howbury Park, which is about an hour and a half outside of London. It's a real place of innovation. Interestingly, there's even a ship simulation center here, and we're sitting in front of the UK's Environment Agency, where you really went to great lengths to apply valuable principles of sustainability, focusing on things like airflow, which, again, that was 16 years ago, and yet it feels like it couldn't be more important or valued now. What can we learn from buildings like Red Kite House, and what are some of the principles that you'll be applying from this design to other buildings?
So when we were invited to be part of that, which is well over 20 years ago, before we even conceived designing this building, the Environment Agency, their brief was very much, we want a sustainable building but it has to also be something that would appeal to everybody. So it shouldn't be so out there with chimneys all over it and look like it's, it needs to be something that is cool and sophisticated that anybody could take. So we looked at how we could approach this with a building that promoted all of the sustainable qualities. So it uses 50% energy, less energy than a similar sized building is a good example. But everything we did, we looked at how could it promote both a healthy workplace through natural ventilation, which it has, but also diminish the energy demands that you put on that building. So this became a real opportunity for us as a practice to do what we've always been saying we wanted to do. So that was a real opportunity for us. What we can learn from it is that a lot of the technology we put into it, it's not rocket science. It's not super sophisticated and go, wow, Darren, that's fantastic. You've hit on this magic silver bullet that we can do all the buildings with now. It's the fact that we're not doing it. And the opportunity is for us to say, okay, these things work, so why aren't we doing it? And why aren't we promoting more fresh air in buildings? Why aren't we looking at how we reduce the energy demands of those buildings? And rather than just saying, well, I'm just going to everyone wanting air conditioning and, we've got huge energy demands on buildings. So we do have a responsibility to actually do what we're saying we're going to do. And I think what we're going to see is buildings like this, and this is only one of many, but buildings like this, the qualities that are in there, we will actually now almost take these buildings and take them apart and look at what do we do now if we were to take it all apart, deconstruct it. So deconstructive architecture is something I've always been quite interested in, and the idea of taking it apart and putting it back together but with all the qualities is something that we're doing now. So we've already done a study, which we'll be publishing soon, on how can you now take this building and put all of the well-being measures into it that we have now and all of the things that people will want and demand to go back into their buildings to have a safe working environment. And what does that building look like? And so that's going to be quite an interesting piece of thought leadership that's going to come out of what we're doing now. So there's lots of opportunities going to come out of this.
So give us a clue, give us a sneak peek. What are some of the elements that you can add to a building such as this, which was already ahead of its time in terms of sustainability, but what can you add to it that you think will be greatly valued in this new environment?
So I think that a lot of the qualities that are in these buildings, and obviously we didn't design them for pandemics, we designed them because they were sustainable and they reduced the demands on energy. And environmentally, they became obviously very friendly as a result. So things like natural ventilation. So these are naturally ventilated. They have automatic openable windows at the top that take the air in at night. They heat the concrete slabs that produces coolth. So that air then drops down into the buildings during the day. And then all of the lower panels of windows are manually operated. So if you want extra air into the building, you can get it. So there isn't any air conditioning in these buildings. It's all done through passive cooling. The other aspects that have been particularly well received, I think, is the sort of ability to be open plan, yet actually be in a sense that you aren't super high dense in with everybody else. And again, that's really, really important. That's something that we will have to address going forward. So a lot of the qualities that these buildings have give us the real platform to then consider, okay, so what would we add in terms of changing this now? And what might we add would be some of the things that you could say, well, we'd wanted to put some of those in on day one, but we weren't thinking that this was coming along. And some of those things are thinking about, okay, you've got this lovely parkland setting, so why not open up all of the facades to the external spaces? And that could easily be done. And that would promote a real sense of being able to get out naturally into the external environment without actually physically having to leave the building. So there's some key qualities. Creating some more terrace space within the buildings as well is something we could do quite easily. And then on the ends of the buildings, we put staircases on the ends of the buildings so that promotes the vertical transportation by using stairs. So by simply enclosing those, we could have an in and an out to deal with the sort of aspects of not cross-contaminating or having people bump into each other. So there's lots of measures that these buildings already have as qualities that we may not have necessarily have designed them in for where we find ourselves today, but could be used as good qualities for changing this building to react to the situation that we find ourselves in now.
At the very beginning, when COVID-19 was at the early stages of the breakout and the crisis, you immediately devoted all of the research and development resources of your firm to solutions within the built environment. What's been the greatest demand or set of demands from your clients?
So, because we addressed it in such a wide-ranging way that we said, well, look, there's no one solution to this. It's going to if you like, the way to address it is going to come through many, many different aspects. What our clients and also people who are just genuinely interested in being part of how do we deal with minimizing contagions in the built environment wanted to do was actually seek to find safer ways of occupying buildings, spaces, and getting, if you like, a reposition normality back into it. So I don't really particularly subscribe to the new norm. There's no new norm. That's just crazy to even put those two words together for me. But you will reposition normality in terms of how we go forward. And it was looking at things like how do people move through spaces. So everything from designing, whether it be aviation, whether it be designing stations, how do people use those, and accepting that people are going to use them again. But you cannot just work on the basis of social distancing alone, because social distancing requires everybody to adhere to it. And the minute people start breaking down with social distancing, whether it be in the workplace or actually outside, then the whole thing falls apart. So that in itself is not a solution. You have to find lots of different ways. So our clients have really ranged from people who've said, how can we get our town centres vibrant again? What do we do to actually make those town centres vibrant again? And so solutions that we've come forward with would be things like saying, we'll turn the streets over to the people, turn them over to pedestrians, to cyclists, put outdoor markets into them, and really use them for the benefit of everybody, and take the cars out of city centres to a degree. Now, I'm not promoting pedestrianisation completely in city centres, because I think that brings its own challenges as well. And I can think of situations where the minute you take the cars and the ability to move around city centres for everybody, when you take that away, sometimes it can kill or decentralise a city centre. You have to be very careful about just making a bold statement, we're going to do this. But if you look at a city centre, think of the City of London, so something I'm promoting now is Cheapside, which is one of the main streets in the City of London. It's a good example. Turn that over to the shops and the bars, take the cars out and make it a park. So turn that road into a whole park, a great big swathe of grass that would go down there, and have all the bars, restaurants, shops, give them the ability to come outside of the buildings and utilise it. And now this doesn't have to be a permanent fixture, but it would encourage a lot of life and vitality back into the city. And one of the key things that cities need to survive is exactly that. They need life and vitality. So when we talk about will we actually have less dense cities, no, I don't believe that's the case. What we need to do is provide more open space, more green space, more parks. Our parks are now overrun. You can't social distance in a park because there aren't enough of them. But what we have done as a result of being only able to travel perhaps in a small area of our own neighbourhood is that we've discovered there's a lot more parks than we actually thought there were. And connecting all of those spaces, I think, through London is an exercise that could be done to really generate a lot of life and vitality. So there's lots of different strands to this that clients have wanted from us. And some of the big ones, I think, will come through the urban design and responsive nature of urban design itself.
One of the things that a lot of people have talked about coming out of lockdown has been the desire to maintain some of the positive aspects, including spending more time together, spending more time outside. What kind of solutions can you envision within urban environments that are a bit starved of green space? How can we make those more accessible, since we all do have this greater demand now? And I don't think people will want to turn back from that.
Well, I think that aspect of it, and it comes back to taking what has been perhaps such a negative experience in being locked down in our homes and all these things, but out of those, every crisis creates opportunity. What we have seen is that people do use our parks, green spaces, a lot more perhaps than they ever did before. But you have to provide that access. So it comes back to the access aspect to it as well. How do you get there? Can I walk there? Can I cycle there? Now, I think what we're seeing is cities are promoting that in a much greater way now. So it isn't just about the destination of the green space. What you should look at is the whole experience is the journey. So cycling to that green space is part of the actual experience for the day out. It's not just get in your car, drive there as quickly as possible, have lunch in the park, get back in the car and drive home. So the park almost becomes the roads as well, so the cycle paths. So you extend the whole experience. The experience should start from the minute you walk out your front door, wherever that is in the city, town, wherever it is, that you enjoy it from the minute you come out. And then you have an extension of the park all the way back to your front door.
How do you manage density and also community? Because we've seen a huge increase in the density of cities, but also a huge demand for community.
The community aspect that we need to promote is access for everybody. So everybody should have access to the same facilities. And the sense of a community, particularly in cities, and what we see more of now, is that because people are locally travelling within their own community, those communities are actually getting stronger. So there's some positives that have come out of this. And I think if we think about the sustainability aspects, if people have only been able to shop within a small distance from their homes, you're actually using the smaller shops more, and perhaps you're supporting your local community. You're not just going to the big supermarkets. And I think I'd like to see that continue, because some of the areas in London that I've experienced over this period have actually now thrived. So the smaller shops have thrived. The diversity in opportunities and what you're able to get in a street is actually increased. And I think they're the sort of things to promote. Not having to travel so far to buy your produce, encouraging local farms and having somewhere to grow it and then bring it short distances. I think all of these sort of things create community. And also I think what I've seen is a balance of two things. I've seen in communities that have really sort of knuckled down and helped each other out. So look, we're all in this together. It doesn't matter who you are, what you do, whether you've got money, haven't got money. We all got to get through this. And I think that some of the positives I've seen out of that have been, really quite encouraging. And I think those are the things that we really need to maintain. And we mustn't just go back to our old ways. Say, right, that's how we did it. As soon as I get back to that, I will. And I actually don't think we will. I think that what we're going to experience is a completely different society coming out of this. And we actually have to encourage not just going back to our old ways.
How much of the built world will undergo transformation and adaptation versus reinventing the wheel? How much can we simply apply innovation to existing buildings?
The innovations that exist are so wide-ranging. They're already there. There's so many things that we can be using already. And you could ask, well, why haven't we? And it's always because there was no demand, there was no need for it. And certain things that we've all sort of laughed at a little bit. And I'll give you a good example, something like an escalator, where if you walk down an escalator, you have two choices. Do I hold the handrail and get all sorts of germs. Forget COVID, or do I risk falling down? Which one do I actually choose there? Yet the technology already exists through UV light to actually cleanse all of those handrails. So that's a small example, but it will make a big change. And just doing those sorts of things will make a big difference to the way we operate. I think things like touchless lifts, touchless door entry systems, all of those things again exist, but now we will see them coming in and being a lot more promoted. So there's some very, very simple things we can do. And then there's the bigger changes that we're going to have to do. And some of those are the real things that we talked about in terms of looking at air changes in buildings, making the buildings cleaner and giving access for people to fresh air, and not feeling that you're hermetically sealed in this box of a building the whole time. So we are going to see, I think, people wanting a change in their buildings, whether it's actually even in their homes. So in your home, the ability to have access to external space is now, we can see, has been an absolute key requirement and something fundamental that people have enjoyed. Even if it's just a terrace to get out onto, you can get outside. And I think that these things come now, we'll see them as a premium, or rather we saw them as a premium before, and now they've become a key requirement that we'll have to do. And it's not that we weren't promoting them perhaps before, it's just, as I say, there was no demand, and that's why we'll see this quantum shift and quantum leap going forward.
So in a way, it sounds like what you're saying is that, of course, we've known for years now that all of the touch points in airports, I think about the bins when you go through security, all those things have been magnets for germs. We've known that.
Yeah.
And yet we've sort of tolerated these handles and all these germ carriers, these hard surfaces. And yet what you're saying is that we won't need to endure these things anymore because now it's a public health issue. So how can we protect and cleanse these touch points without tearing everything down and rebuilding and coming up with something really out there?
Well, there's going to be a range. I think there's going to be the really simple things we can do, and then where we have to address and repurpose buildings, and then think about the new buildings and what should they look like. I think we shouldn't underestimate as well. It's really important looking back in history when we look at material science to think about the good things that were being done perhaps back in the 1930s, where hospitals had door handles in brass or copper and handrails in brass or copper because pathogens can only live for a certain amount of time on those materials. Whereas we've replaced all that with stainless steel, where pathogens can live on them for simply hours, if over long periods of time. And so some of the things that were good once could be reintroduced. Now, I'm not suggesting that we just put copper on all the handrails. What we need to do is look at smart materials, so nanotechnology films that can go onto films and sprays that can go onto door handles if you have to have door handles. Touchless entry systems, the ability to not actually have to touch a door and open it. Again, all of these things exist, but we should be doing them. And if you go to an airport, it's a good example. If you go into a toilet area in an airport, there aren't any doors. It's all controlled by space differentiation, so you don't actually have to touch any doors. So a lot of the things that we know should be dialed out, we didn't because perhaps of cost. Now we will be doing it. And I think there's that real opportunity to look at how we deal with those aspects. Building a digital twin of an environment as well can help tremendously because it can study, for instance, how pathogens might move in airflows with buildings. And we can also then put avatars into those buildings to simulate sick people. And then you can figure out through mathematical programs then on what would be the effect and how quickly could it spread. So there's, on one level, just copper and brass over here to really building digital twins of environments. And that's really what we're able to do now.
how will residential architecture be different? Will there be more demand for more adaptable spaces, even in smaller, more compact settings?
I think it's inevitable because the shift that people will want and balance to work from home on a greater emphasis will shift the balance on how you use your homes. And yeah, it's fine if you have a big home with a garden and lots of spaces within it. But if you think about city centres and apartments and apartment design in particular, the ability to have a home office or a space designed into that apartment that can be a home office. It might not be it the whole time, but the ability to have adaptable spaces, I think, is where we're really going to head. So as the demand for home working increases, and I think it's fundamental that it will increase as we go forward, then so will the demand to have residential spaces designed to be responsive to that requirement. I think the other aspect as well is access to external space at home as well. And that doesn't necessarily mean it just needs to be a balcony tacked on the outside of an apartment. It can be use of a roof space on a apartment building. It can be an external space that has communal use within areas, courtyards. Quite often in London you see courtyards filled with cars. Take the cars out and make those gardens. So quite often in central London you see a courtyard with maybe 3 cars in it, but it's designed for at least 100. So why not say there isn't going to be any provision for those cars and let's turn those into garden areas. So I think there's going to be some very simple shifts we see that you might see through furniture design, so a dining table that doubles as a desk when you want it to, through to then big changes in how we design apartments, centres.
With so many people happily working from home, and admittedly, not everyone is, how will we see the future of the workplace changing? Will we see the death, which many are desperate to see, of the cubicle and of the open plan office? What will change?
What will change is what people want from the workplace. So one of the things that we're promoting as a business and talking to occupiers about is shifting from an hours-based culture to a task-based culture. So we can see that offices will be places for collaboration rather than somebody just go to work. So there's nothing wrong with actually promoting the working from home. I think, having that live-work balance and actually encouraging a greater quality of life is something that we would like to promote. Does that mean the death of the open plan office space? I don't think it does either. I think what it does mean, though, is that the densities will change. So we won't be so densely packed into our offices. There will be space between. And then it'll be those in-between spaces, in between the desks. So what happens between them? So I think the demand for office space is always going to be there. We want to be together. We want to be there to collaborate, and you want to be around other people. And I think some of the biggest problems that we will see coming out of the pandemic will be actually the lack of access people have had to others, and particularly their work colleagues. So some of the problems we might see, we haven't actually experienced yet. So getting back into the workplace is really, really important. But it's what people are going to want from it is what we're really focusing on. So if we think about meeting settings, if you have access to a terrace or an outdoor space, so some of the things that are going to be at premium in offices are access to external spaces. And that might be a roof terrace, but it could also be a terrace or atrium within a building that you create an opportunity to get fresh air into it. So you create an external environment within an internal building.
Sort of like we see quite often in Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. So from our Singapore office, a lot of the things we're doing out there is that they're naturally embracing the external environments to have access to, to air, if you like. But the other thing is air quality, so it brings it back to sustainability. The air quality outside has to be good enough, and this is where you can't just say, right, we're going to put all of the planes back in the air, all of the cars back on the road, and we're actually going to go back to what the air quality was like. We have to maintain this clean air policy within our cities as well, because that's fundamental. If we're going to use an external space, the air is good enough to be able to use it.
The skyscraper has been an emblem of period architecture throughout history. I mean, you could point to any number of skyscrapers, and it tells us so much about the era in which it was erected. So many people are suggesting and speculating that we no longer need these very tall buildings if we're not going to be using offices in the same way. Do you think that we're going to see the death of the skyscraper?
No, definitely not. I think where cities, where space is at a premium, what we will be doing is finding more creative ways that actually exist. If you look at, again, somewhere like Southeast Asia, look at what we're doing in Singapore, where we're doing vertical gardens up the buildings. We've produced a similar design for a tower in New York, where it has a sky garden where you actually walk up the whole building through a garden, end up in a garden at the top. It has natural ventilation. It has ways of cleaning the air in those buildings. So it's not the death of the skyscraper, but it does mean that we will rethink some of the approaches we perhaps had on how you just have 16 people in a lift and you're all going to go up. There may be other alternatives that work with that then help promote actually vertical use of buildings in cities. So it's definitely not the death of it, but we will see a greater demand again for external spaces in tall buildings. And I think if you go to some of the major cities, and what are the major attractions? Having an outdoor space and a sky garden on the top of a building that looks over a city, that's what people want as a premium. That should be the norm. So if you look at it and say, well, why should it only be a select amount of society that can go up and experience something like that? That should be something that's open to everybody to experience. So I think the ability to put gardens, where they're public gardens in buildings, and yet, sure, there's security issues with that, but those are the sort of things we'll just have to overcome them. And we will overcome them because they will be things that promote, again, healthy design in tall buildings. And it's going to be a fundamental requirement that will come through in what we do with tall buildings.
So if this is not the death of the skyscraper, yet it is the death of the 16-person capacity lift, how will we get people up and down buildings like skyscrapers? How will vertical transportation work?
I think there's lots of opportunities to look at for new buildings. Obviously, with existing buildings, it's a greater challenge. But I think there'll be a much greater demand on using the staircases in buildings, so making them an environment you want to walk up. So you've got that whole idea of well-being to walk up maybe once in a day. Sure, if you're on the 40th floor, you're not going to do that every day, or sort of just go down to get your sandwich, you're not going to go down there. But that's where you might find that there are terraces at different locations through the tall buildings, so you don't have to go right down to the bottom of the streetscape. So you look at them more as the term that's perhaps been used for a vertical village, where you have lots of different uses within the buildings as a whole. I think looking at staircases where you don't have to pass each other, so designing a double helix stair, which is effectively a stair that goes one way, one that goes the other way, and it intertwines. So you could have one that goes up, one that goes down, all in the same space of a traditional staircase. And again, some of these aren't these things aren't new. You can go back centuries to look at how double helix stairs were actually designed, and there are good examples of them being in use today.
One of the things that you did very early on in this crisis was to collaborate far and wide about solutions for the built environment, including tapping the minds of the Formula One team about the dynamics of good airflow. What can you share about what you learned from them and others that really represents innovation or a very different way of approaching a problem? I don't think most architects would think about talking to the F1.
I think the emphasis was placed on what are the problems we've got to face, and we might not have the solutions, but if we combine lots of different approaches, then we'll come up with a solution or range of solutions that can consider the same thing. So if you look at Formula One technology, where they study airflows over cars, they have simulators that can figure out, how air flows over a car. And in the same way, that's where we employed the digital twins to look at how then air could flow through spaces. So it was more of a narrative with them to say, look, these are the issues. What do you think? We're architects, you're engineers and designers. What do you think? And they in turn then introduced us to companies, for instance, that dealt with putting hydroxyl radicals into buildings themselves. So, and what hydroxyl radicals are? They exist in the open air, and that's why pathogens can't exist outside in the same way they can in buildings. So, can you artificially put those hydroxyl radicals into buildings? Now, this is something I'd never thought of before. I'd approach somebody like that, so then the discussion widens out and widens out. Before you know it, we're talking about all these other things, and then we're getting nanotechnology surfaces and things like that. So, I think they're some of the really good examples of saying, look, this is what we've got to achieve. This is what we think we can bring to it. But let's fill in the holes now and say, well, okay, we've got some brilliant minds out there. And if we put them all together, we will come up with a range of solutions that'll be almost like a suite of things that can be used to deal with the spread of contagions within our environment that we find ourselves. And that's really the purpose of the Design Research Unit. That's what we really wanted it to do from day one, was to say, look, we're not saying we got the answers necessarily, but through evidence-based design, we will get to the solutions.
It sounds very much like you take the approach that no idea is a bad idea. Look under every rock that might be interesting or shed some unusual point of view on a problem. Is that your approach?
Well, I would say that I've found through life that not every bad idea is a bad idea. Sometimes they really are bad ideas. But seriously, it's about saying, look, what are the things that we need to solve, and let's find a range of solutions that might address it, and also not being afraid to fail, because I think that's really important as well. Sometimes we don't, or I've seen situations where we don't try something because we think, oh, that might not work. But you don't know that it won't work. It might not work first time round, but it might work eventually. And I think that some of the greatest innovations that we've seen in all sorts of society have come through things where you think, well, that would never work. No, I'm not going to bother doing that. And then you do it and you think, actually, do you know what? That didn't work, but this worked out of the result of it. So I think it brings it whole full circle to how perhaps I've approached a lot of things, whether it be in architecture or what have you, is that, it comes back to what I was saying about education and first jobs. It might not be the ultimate job you want, but it might take you somewhere else. So give it a go and see what comes out of it. And I think the pandemic that we find ourselves in is a challenge that if we had the solutions straight off, we'd all just be doing them and we'd all be sort of working through it. But we don't, so we have to find them. So we've got to try a range of options to then find what solution will deal with what problem most effectively.
So do you encourage your research team to look at problems with a very 3D prism?
100%. And the ideas that come back are things that, everybody's really gifted in the practice. And so some of the ideas that have come through have been so left of centre, but they're fantastic. They're really interesting. And everyone's thinking about different things and how we might approach things in society, whether it's through the social contact pod that was designed by one of the teams to deal with how could people get connection without actually interfacing physically with each other, to deal with the mental health issues that may be storing up out there. And
what does that pod look like?
So it's a prefabricated pod that has air changes, it has a perspex screen in it, and then it has a best way of describing it is a fluid plastic that you could grab somebody's hand through a aperture within it. but it's totally self-cleansing. So it uses UV light, it has air changes, it has all of the things that we may see coming through into our buildings, all in one compact space. It's also super environmentally friendly, so it's totally made of timber, and everything about it has utilised the sort of knowledge that we've got through everything we've done in other aspects of architecture. So that's one thing that months ago we'd never thought of doing something like that, and who knows what else is going to come out of those sort of things. So if you consider transportation, getting to the workplace is the first thing you need to think about before you even think about, well, how do we make the workplace safe? How do you make it safe to get to the workplace? So if we think about transportation and how we make trains, airplanes, cycleway, everything is about safety, and do I feel comfortable getting back to that workplace? So some of the things that came out of our transport sector have been really interesting as well, about how do you make people confident back in society, and that's a really, really important aspect. And then some of the technological aspects of that you might look at in terms of, once you're in the building, how do we address getting in a lift? So UV light in lifts, for instance, touchless lift entry systems, perhaps having a vertical screen in the middle, so maybe only two people for the time being can use a lift. So that one walks in one side, walks in the other, and you're segregated from that other person. Fanciful things perhaps were thought about 4 months ago, but now we may be saying, well, we need to design lifts that can actually be segregated if required. So maybe a lift is wider this way, and you make it into certain portions of that lift. So you could still get 8 people in it, but the lift's a lot thinner, and it has doors that open up and you get into it in a slightly different way. So a lot of these things I'm sure people are thinking about as we're thinking about them. And some of them won't happen, but some of them perhaps we might see them being more mainstream. And even things like sanitizing handrails on escalators through using UV light. It seems to me it has to be done.
So life will get better.
Life will improve considerably.
What's been the biggest learning for you throughout all this?
So I think the biggest learning, there's two levels. There's a personal level, and then there's a sort of slightly wider level. I think on a personal level, what have I learned? I've learned that there's always positives that comes out of every negative. And it's not about, creating an opportunity out of, a crisis necessarily just as a one-dimensional aspect. It's about thinking, okay, these are the set of problems that we've got, and these are the skills that I now need to learn to actually deal with them, because a lot of those skills none of us needed before that. So it's finding ways to actually upskill yourself as an individual and then deal with them with all the experience that you've got coming along that line to actually get to that place in the first instance. So I will come out of this as a different person, for sure. And who knows when we're going to come out of it. So I could learn a lot more by the time we're fundamentally out. And then I think there's a global aspect of seeing how innovative lots of different companies, people have responded to the challenges in hand. And also then the willingness to embrace ideas with each other and share knowledge. So when we started with the Design Research Unit back in March to address these issues, it was never a case of us saying, well, we're going to get all the data and then we're going to look like we're super clever and we're going to hand it out as this is the way to address it. It was always, from the start, a collaborative arrangement where we said, will you help us? We have these skills, but what skills do you have? And if we put them all together, we're going to come out a lot richer. So again, I think it's that sort of, where do you want to be seen in society? And what's your attitude towards society? And with a situation like this as a crisis, how you behave going through it and how you respond to the challenges in hand is almost directly viewed in how you will be responded to coming out of it. So will your clients look at you and think, do you know what, when it went really terribly wrong, these guys were nowhere to be seen? Or will they say, do you know what, when it all went bad, they all knuckled down and looked for solutions. There was no financial reward for them. They said, this is a way, a responsibility that you have, and they found those solutions, even if they're small solutions. The fact that you tried it is worth it. So I think there's some, amongst what is such a hugely negative experience for so many people, and don't underestimate that, and for ourselves, that there are big negatives towards it. If we can have massive hope, it's that there's some real positive changes that come out the other.
I was going to ask you what you'll be happiest to see change, but I think I know. I think you'll be happiest to see these self-cleaning touch spaces, self-cleaning escalator handles and everything else.
I think that's one aspect of it. I think that's the direct aspect of it. But what would I really be happy seeing change? I think the changes in society in the way that we treat each other, actually, the way we use spaces, and that, even in that, is like, how do we treat each other? Having more respect for each other's spaces outside, more respect for people in society, accepting that we all have to coexist together. And I think what I'd like to see as the biggest positive change is that people don't forget that, and that we all had to operate on the same level. And it's about, what can I contribute to providing a more positive society? And I think if that bow wave continues, then we're going to see some real positive change going forward. And I come back to this, we simply cannot just go back to the way it was.
Last question. We like to end each podcast by asking the question, if you could change one thing about the global conversation on urban design, what would it be?
I think it's about, for me, it's looking about sustainability, but on all of the levels. So there's a great emphasis on sustainability on the environmental aspect, but I do think that we mustn't forget the social and economic aspects, and open it up to remember that sustainability is more than one aspect, and that each one of them provides a solution to the other. And I think we're seeing that actually now, although we can't quite recognise it at the moment, because we're dealing with, quite rightly, the health of people on the planet. And what we've seen over this period of the pandemic, and particularly in city centres, is that if you're fortunate enough that you can lock down in a nice apartment with a nice terrace, or you have a house with a garden, yeah, fine. But that's only a very small percentage of society. So when we look at the economic dynamics here, we have to accept that a lot of people don't have that choice. They have the choice of, do I go out and actually earn money to buy food for my family, or do I just stay in and starve? And that's a massive issue, and we cannot just ignore that. And then you've got the social aspects that fit within that as well. So again, there's no one size that fits all. The luxury of saying, yeah, lockdown hasn't been so bad, that's a small minority that can really have the opportunity of saying that. And I think we have to address all of these issues. Otherwise, we're going to store up a real problem for the future generations of not dealing with the issue that has been presented to us now. So out of what is, a very unpleasant, unfortunate set of circumstances, this gives us the opportunity to deal with it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have dealt with it. But now it's put it front and centre for me. And I'd like to see that everybody gets on board with this and finds a way of addressing each of those different aspects to provide what I'll call real, true sustainability, not just the one that grabs the limelight.
Thank you, Darren. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for asking me. It's been a real delight talking to you. Thank you.
You've been listening to Perspectives in Motion, an original podcast from Schindler. I'm Amy Gutman. You can find additional episodes, guest bios, and other related content on our website, schindler.com/podcast.